In this episode of Akram's Ideas, I'm sharing my vintage year in review, so stay tuned! Hello and welcome. I'm Akram Tagavi-Burith, and you're watching Akram's Ideas, bringing creative and crazy ideas to life. If you've watched Akram's Ideas for a while, you know that I am a lover of all things vintage, whether that's vintage fashion or vintage decor. I frequent antique stores and come across all sorts of vintage items, but I haven't really shared a whole lot of my vintage passion on the channel, and that's something that I'd like to change for 2019. So I thought I'd wrap up the year of 2018 by sharing a hashtag that's been going around on Instagram called Vintage Year in Review. To see more episodes like this, be sure to click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to get notified of new videos. This is a challenge hosted by at I Live in My Lab and at Make This Look. Both are amazing vintage bloggers. They have this amazing vintage and vintage inspired style. If you're looking for really fun vintage looks, I would definitely check out their Instagrams. I'll put the links to both of them in the comments below. But they came up with a week-long prompt for sharing some of your favorite vintage finds from 2018. And I thought that I would share this here on YouTube. Now, I've already gone through and did them on Instagram, so you can see some of the photos there as well. And you can just search the hashtag Vintage Year in Review. There are some amazing, very drool-worthy items that people have posted in correspondence to the prompts for the challenge. But I thought, since not everybody on YouTube follows my Instagram, I would share them here as well. And in video format, you get to see them see the items a little bit differently. Before I get into the prompts, I just wanted to make mention to what I'm wearing, because this whole pairing is something that I do quite frequently. And it's a pairing of ready-to-wear, me-made, and vintage. So the top that I'm wearing is just a ready-to-wear top that I've had for a long time, and the skirt is a me-made Grinham pleated semi-circle skirt. It's a really nice skirt. It's even lined. I made it a few years ago, and so it goes really well with the top. And then, of course, I have a true vintage sweater that I'm wearing. I love this sweater, and it was such a find. I think I paid $15 for it. It's probably from the 60s, 50s, based on its tag, and the buttons that are used on it. It's got this beautiful floral decor here. But this is again a perfect example of how I like to dress. A little mix of everything from me-made to vintage to ready-to-wear with this sort of vintage-inspired silhouette. And as you can see, I'm doing the whole little 50s thing today. Very pink and white. I thought since it's winter time, white is appropriate. I'm gonna go with that as my excuse for wearing white. I will say, since this sweater is white, it does not actually get worn very often. I don't do well in white, and sometimes I wonder why I have white items in my closet at all. But I figured I'd wear it for this video because I do really love this sweater, and it is true vintage. So with that said, let's get into the hashtag Vintage Year in Review. So the first prompt of the Vintage Year in Review is just a recap of who you are and how you got into vintage, or a little introduction. So obviously I'm Akram from Akram's Ideas, and How I got into vintage was relatively an interesting story. I believe I even have a blog post that I wrote several years ago on my blog, and I'll put the link to it in the comments below if I find it. But it all started about 2012. I was feeling kind of in a rut. My husband kept telling me I needed a hobby because all I did was work. That's all I did. And I really didn't have a hobby. Then that same year, my mother-in-law gifted me my Bernina Recorder 830, a vintage sewing machine. And I started playing with the idea of learning to sew. At the same time, I was feeling kind of a lull in my wardrobe. We had just moved, I just changed jobs. I was at this sort of midpoint in life, trying to figure it all out. And I really didn't like what I was wearing or how I was styling things. And I ended up somehow on the interwebs, ended up reading a blog from that retro chick or something like that. Her blog has since changed. I forget what it is now, but it was Retro Chick when I first came across it. And she was posting vintage and vintage inspired clothes that she had been wearing. And I started thinking about how I loved that style, and started thinking back about how even as a teenager I was kind of wearing some items that were vintage or vintage inspired, things that I thought looked vintagey, but never really pursued it because I always felt kind of out of trend because of what I was wearing. But my dream, and my dream still is to have every single outfit from the 60s film The Parent Trap. I want every single outfit from that film. That film is like my ideal wardrobe. That has been long since one of my favorite movies as a kid, and even as a kid I wanted every single outfit from that movie. But again, as a teenager you kind of want to do the trend thing, and vintage wasn't very popular, so I went down the path of Hot Topic, if you're familiar with that store, and the goth scene. And it's interesting too because the goth scene was really just 19th century fashion with some weird embellishments like zippers and such. But there were these big fluffy dresses and stuff, and I felt like I could get away with it because with this goth thing. But like I said, 2012, I got a sewing machine, and it dawned on me at that point, you know what, I have a sewing machine. I could just sew vintage clothes. Especially since vintage clothes were hard to find. There were antique stores, but not really a lot of clothing or clothes that were in good shape. And two, most of the clothes that I do find were never in my size. So it was kind of a bummer when I did come across something that I really liked. So the sewing machine changed my life. I was going to now sew clothes that were vintage or vintage style. And from then on, I just kind of evolved into doing more vintage style clothes. At the same time, irony of this all, getting the vintage sewing machine and everything, we had just moved at that time to a Victorian home built in 1893, is that right? Yeah, 1893. And my husband totally went into this whole, we have a Victorian home, it has to be styled Victorian style with all this massive architecture. He has a lot of architectural background as well, so he wanted all the flounces and molding, and so we started buying a lot of vintage decor for our home. So from there on, we just ended up getting a lot of vintage stuff and falling in love with it, I should say, more so than I thought I ever would have had the opportunity to be in love with vintage. The second prompt to the Vintage Year in Review was, what was your best acquisition of 2018 as far as vintage goes? Best acquisition this year was a series of wool coats. And I'll toss some pictures up of me actually wearing these, but this one here is a black one. And this one has the tag. It is a Carol Brent coat. It is again probably from the late 60s, late 50s, mid 60s. It's got that swingish style to it. It's in great condition. And this one I got at one of my favorite frequented antique stores, Peddler's Junction. This was hanging up one day by the front door as I came in. And immediately behind this black wool coat was another wool coat. This one in a beautiful red wool. Right here, also lined with this beautiful satin lining. This coat is by a brand called Brent Shire. Almost very similar tag. That one was Carol Brent, and this was Brent Shire. But again, beautiful condition, lovely red, bold colors. And then finally, behind the red coat was hanging this lovely sort of mustard yellow coat. And I picked them up. I picked up the black one first because obviously black is what you're going to be wearing the most. And I tried it on and it fit. And then I saw the red one, and I love red, and started looking at them, and my husband comes by, and then I see the yellow one, and he's like, are you gonna wear yellow? Is that something you'd wear? And as we were discussing it, the sales lady had noticed me looking at these, and she told me, you know what, if you want all three, you can have them for $30. So that's $10 a coat. And I was like, yes, I'll take it. I wasn't planning on buying a coat. Needless to say, 3 coats. And I really, obviously the black one was, I figured would get the most wear, and then red, because I have a lot of red in my wardrobe. Holiday season would be coming up. This was late September when we bought these. But then the yellow one was an interesting one because I hadn't really ever thought of this mustardy color coat. And I really didn't even know if I get anywhere out of it at all, but I ended up wearing this yellow one maybe even more so than the other two because I wore it all through the end of October into November on cold days. And it was a great autumn coat, and I really love them. It's probably the best buy of the year because I've worn them so frequently, each and every one of them. I've like swapped them out throughout the weeks. All of them have these wonderful collars and lapels that obviously there were brooches at one point on the lapels, and I'm looking for brooches to kind of match the coats or the style that I can put on there. I did actually, I'll even come in close with this, just recently found this beautiful yellow floral brooch. And it's got flowers, so it looks kind of springy, but then at the same time, it although looks like it could just be autumn florals as well. I thought this was the perfect addition to this coat because it has some contrast, but then it does blend in as well. I love brooches with my coats. In fact, I have a good sized vintage brooch collection as well. So yes, that is my best acquisition of the year. The next prompt on the vintage year in review is the new appreciation. Maybe there's something that you never really appreciated before, but this year you've been collecting and now have a whole new appreciation for. And this for me is vintage inspired shoes. Now obviously vintage shoes are never going to fit me. I have a 8.5, size 9, between 8.5 and a 9 foot. Vintage shoes that I come across are lucky to be close to a 6, if not smaller. There are several vintage inspired shoe manufacturers out there that I follow on Instagram, one of which is Bait. Bait shoes I've been following for a long time. I've seen a lot of the vintage bloggers and vloggers wear Bait shoes, but they're expensive. And not only are they expensive, they're shoes. I have a love-hate relationship with shoes. A lot of other girls, my sisters, for example, love shoes. They have tons and tons of shoes. But I have a love-hate relationship for shoes because, one, I always leery about buying shoes online because I don't know if they're gonna fit. I'm leery about whether they are comfortable. I'm on my feet pretty much all day standing in front of class, that I can't have an uncomfortable shoe. It just drives me crazy. Plus, I can't have a very incredibly high heel because I have such problems with my feet and my knee that high heels, large heels, anything over 3 inches, I'm done for. I can't really walk around in those types of shoes, at least not for long periods. So a comfortable shoe is important, and a usable shoe. And it's hard to find shoes that have a nice vintage look to them. But I have, like I said, been fawning over these vintage inspired shoes. And so when my birthday came around and I was going to do the pinup shoot, and if you haven't checked out that story about my birthday dress and my pinup shoot, you can check it out over here. But when my birthday came around and I knew I was going to do the pinup shoot and I was making a special dress, I decided to splurge and get myself these Bait green and cream shoes that I've been fawning over forever. So I was actually following Bait through Zulily, and these shoes came up on clearance for $40. And they had my size. I was leery about buying these because, again, I couldn't try them on, but I really wanted these shoes, and they had the 8.5, so I went ahead and bought them. They do fit. It would have been nice if they were slightly wider, but they fit fairly well. I wore them for the pinup shoot. They're so beautiful. I love these shoes. But while I was buying these shoes on sale, I noticed they had some other ones on sale. And I had been in need of a red shoe for quite a while. And this is an amazing shoe. Again, the heel on this is no more than 3 inches. I think it's maybe even 2.5. It's beautiful. It's got the open toe. I have a love-hate relationship with open toe shoes, but this was so pretty, I couldn't resist. It's got a very 40s silhouette to it. These are just so pretty. And what's even better is that they're all so comfortable, so comfortable. So I got that one, and then I also found these pink ones. And these pink ones are really nice because I have a lot of pink in my wardrobe, and I really just been wearing them with brown shoes. I really haven't had the opportunity to wear them with pink shoes because I didn't have any pink shoes. So these pink shoes, again, they're open toe, which means that I really only wore them in the early days of fall before it got cold. But I do plan to wear them more in the summer and spring. But I needed pink shoes in my wardrobe, and I'm really glad that I got these lovely things. Like I said, they've been really, really comfy. I have been like on this shoe thing now and have been watching Zulily and Bait for sales because these are so comfortable, and because they give that outfit just even more so that vintage look and feel. So the right accessories are just as important as the look itself. And so I have a new appreciation for vintage shoes and, of course, vintage inspired shoes, and I plan on hopefully increasing my collection of these Bait footwear in my wardrobe. The next prompt for Vintage Year in Review is biggest regret. Typically we come across really great bargains, and I don't usually pass up on items, but at certain times, some of the times I feel a little overwhelmed. I have a lot of stuff. I collect a lot. It's a problem. But I've got a lot of hats, and I really don't need any more hats. So we were at one of our frequented antique stores, and one time we see this beaded hat, and I thought I took a picture of it. I looked through all my photos. I couldn't find it, so I'll show a photo of a similar hat. And so this is something from like the 20s. I don't know if this was true vintage or a reproduction, but it was $85. And granted, it was all totally beaded. It was a beautiful headdress, and my husband actually pointed it out to me, and he's like, "You want that?" And I thought to myself at first, I'm like, "Yeah, I totally do, but I'll never wear it." And he was all like, "Oh, well, you could just put it on display. I mean, look at it. It's all beaded. It's really cool." And I'm like, "Yeah, but it's $85 and I've got so many hats." And keep in mind, at the same time, I'm still trying to organize my hats. I do not have a hat solution. Some of them are in pegs. I got hats everywhere. So I was feeling overwhelmed by the idea of bringing home another headpiece. And so I passed on the beaded hat for $85. I have not since seen that beaded hat. Somebody bought it. You know, that was one of those things that I thought, you know what, if I come back next time, because we frequent that like every other week, we go to that antique store. If I come back and it's still there, then it was meant to be. We come back and it wasn't there. And I'm like, who the heck bought that? You know, I mean, it's not something that is obviously that somebody's going to buy. But that was my biggest regret of the year, is not buying that, because it was so cool. And it was the perfect, you know, cosplay for Franny Fisher or something like that. And I wish that I'd gotten it, but at the same time, I've gotten a lot of other good deals, so I'm not too horribly depressed about it. But it is one of the regrets that I have not purchasing this year. The next prompt on the Vintage Year in Review is achievement. So one of the things that we have been trying to achieve, and we are going to be continuing with that, is to make our current home more vintage style. Now, like I said earlier, back in 2012, we had moved to Pittsburg, Kansas. And when we moved to Pittsburg, Kansas, a tiny, tiny little town in Kansas, we ended up buying a 1893 Victorian home. And that home had amazing details. It had a lot of molding. It had some great architectural elements in that home. It had high ceilings. It was just very, very much a Victorian home. Granted, it was also built in 1893, and it had a lot of problems, including electrical problems, the foundation problems. It was an old home, and we were constantly fixing it up. So when we ended up moving back to Tulsa, we bought a newer home. So this home that we live in now was built in 2010, so it's modern construction. And we don't have to worry about anything from electricals to the walls caving in or foundation. It's on a slab foundation. It's pretty sturdy. There hasn't been any problems with the house. Now, the house is modern, so it's got a lot of modern elements. It doesn't really have the molding and things like that. Now, there was some elements that we really loved that did give it a little bit of character. The ceilings in both the living room and the master bedroom are like 12-foot ceilings, and it also has these amazing molding in both of those rooms. But the rest of the house is pretty average. But we wanted, having lived in the Victorian home, we really wanted to bring some of that Victorian style to our new home. And we decided to do that by incorporating some architectural details and whatnots. So one of the things that we have achieved in the bedroom, which is amazing, and we just did this, we just did this a few weeks ago. We had gotten, when we were up in Pittsburgh, we had gotten a wooden mantle for the fireplace that was all very vintage, very antique. I don't know if it was true antique. I would say that it was probably from the 50s, but it was very much this epic kind of mantle that we ended up bringing with us when we moved to Tulsa, because it was ours, so we didn't want to leave it behind. And we didn't really have a place for the mantle. We do have a fireplace in the living room, but it's a very nice brick fireplace, and we have some other plans, some other achievements for that fireplace. Because of the size of the master bedroom and the scale of it, my husband really wanted a fireplace in the master bedroom so that we could lay in bed and watch the crackling fire. And there are two issues with that. One, there's not a fireplace, and two, our bed sits really high. We have this canopy bed frame and everything, and we got this really big high bed. So it has to be pretty high. In fact, we even have a love seat that comes in front of the bed. So it has to be taller than a love seat to be able to see over it in the bed. And he had purchased a little electric log set to create a faux fireplace. And he immediately thought of our mantle that we had bought, and he brought the mantle in, and it was really nice. It looked really good on the wall. But the problem was, again, because our bed sits so high, we couldn't really see the fireplace. And as usual, I am always in need of storage, and I had been telling him I needed a dresser. And we just happened to go antiquing, and there had been some antique stores near the university where I work that we had never gotten to go to. Primarily because we live on the south side and they're up on the north side, and so we just, I go there every day for work. I don't want to have to drive back up to north side on my day off. But we decided on a whim that we were finally going to get up there and head to those antique stores. And lo and behold, we come into the antique store, and there they have this massive French Provençal dresser, including the mirrors, the bed frames, the side table, for what was it, $200? I mean, it was cool. The antique store was actually getting ready to move location, so they had a heavy discount on everything, and we snatched it up. It was the perfect size for that wall, and like I said, I needed the storage. And so what we ended up doing is we sat the mantle on top of the dresser. Yes, we did. And the little fireplace, oh my gosh, here you'll see in the picture. This is amazing. It like gives automatic drama to the bedroom. It is just fabulous. Like I said, we have a pretty large master bedroom, and it just gives all this architectural detail to the room. Having that, we've mounted the fireplace or the mantle onto the wall, so it's actually mounted to the wall and then sets on top of the dresser. We're not too concerned about scuffing up the top of the dresser, since the top of the dresser wasn't in pristine condition, but it works for our needs. The dresser, it has a lot of storage, which was fabulous for what I was needing. And then the mantle, it's just amazing. We even added some garland at the top for Christmas. It's just beautiful. It is amazing. And that's kind of the achievements that we want in our vintage style, is to have more of those elements and make this house not look so modern. Make it look like it could have been built in the Victorian era and have these details and things like that. So that is our biggest achievement for 2018. Favorite look of the year is in the next prompt on the vintage year in review. It's obviously my birthday dress and my pinup photos that I did. Granted, all of that was actually brand new. The dress was me made, the shoes were brand new, but they were very much vintage inspired, and the hair was very much a vintage 40s style, and I thoroughly enjoyed that look. That's kind of like the look that I'd like to achieve on a regular basis, but know that I'm not that patient to work with it. But I do have a little bit of a 40s slash 60s daily look. If I work at it, I can achieve that. But that is the ultimate look that I'd like to achieve. The last prompt for vintage year in review are fashion goals for 2019. So I'm not going to get too much into this because I still plan to do my sewing resolutions next month and talk a little bit about how I'm going to change up some of my sewing habits. My biggest problems that I have is that I collect a lot of items. I collect a lot of handbags, I collect a lot of hats, a lot of vintage brooches, but I never feel like any of these accessories match anything in my wardrobe. And so my biggest goal this year is to, instead of just randomly making clothes, is to actually say, I am going to make this item to match with these accessories. So I want to make sure that whatever I'm going to make or purchase, I have things to match with it. Not that I'm just making or buying things that, oh, I have nothing to match with this or nothing to wear with this. So I'm going to be very, very much determined to look at my wardrobe and look at my items and say, you know what, I have this hat. I'm gonna make a dress to go with this hat, and so forth and so forth. I'd also like to make things that are more versatile so that I can mix and match as needed. So these are the biggest vintage fashion goals that I have for 2019. And that is it for my vintage year in review. And I'd love to hear in the comments below if you yourself are interested in vintage style, vintage fashion, if you'd like to see more episodes like this where I talk about my vintage passion. If you're interested in any of that stuff, again, let me know in the comments below. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Akram's Ideas. As always, thanks for watching.
The last prompt of Vintage Year in Review are goals for whether that's a vintage style. Oh, I messed up again. I'd love. Let me do that over. Okay, we'll do this again.